This week we sold our parents' home, which was my childhood home from the age of 10 um, up until when I left home at 18. And it's been my parents' home for over 30 years until the time that they died, which, for my dad was 4 years ago and for my mum was 18 months ago. And yeah, my sister and I, we we agreed to a sale this week, just gone, and with all things being well, give it a couple of months, and yeah, the house will be sold. And so I thought it was probably a good time to do a video on grief, because it occurred to me that you know everyone's grief is different, and uh, when someone dies, I think the grief can be quite acute, and in that moment and in the days that follow and the weeks that follow, I think it can be overwhelming. But also, there's lots of other things that happen, such as you know property, for example, that carry grief with them because they carry memories. They symbolize something. They embody a life that once was and people who once were that are no more. And I think that's the one thing I would probably say has surprised me about grief is that I realize now that you can grieve things even if they don't necessarily die. And I think I first experienced real grief when my wife and I lost our baby Noah in 2018. And I suppose that was what I'd always thought of as grief. The idea that you lose a person who you love. And and then in 2021, my dad died quite unexpectedly. He'd been poorly, but we certainly didn't expect him to die when he did. And my dad was my mum's main carer. And so when he died, it meant that my mum was in a vulnerable place, whereby, you know, she was at risk of harm to herself and possibly harm to others. Um, and she had very little ability, to take care of herself, even though, she maintained her independence despite, my best efforts until the day that she died, which was in May of 2024. And so, yeah, I think, grief is different for everybody. And I think, when people do die, like we might have people who support us who have experienced grief, and, their experience very often is invaluable at that time. I had wonderful people around me to support me, through each death, that I've experienced, really, that we've had in our family. I've had close friends who've lost parents. We got involved with a charity, my wife and I, and met other people who'd also lost their babies. And so I think for me, that has hugely helped with grief, and with understanding that grief is different for everybody. It's not something that you're going to be able to kind of, you can't pick up a textbook, and I remember once kind of Googling, grief and the stages of grief. And I think, they talk about kind of stage of denial and stage of anger and eventually a stage of acceptance. But in all honesty, I think for me, I could probably feel any or all of those things on any particular day. You know, like that's what grief was for me. It was a complete roller coaster. And very often I would have very strong emotions and I wouldn't know why. But of course, the why was grief. That's what it is. It seems inexplicable in a moment. It could be 2 months, 3 months, 6 months after my dad died, and I'd be doing something, I don't know, mundane, like, I don't know, messaging people at work, and I would be sat there with this like fury inside me, this like really burning sensation of like absolute rage and anger, and I wouldn't have a clue where it come from, and I'd berate myself because I'd be like, well, yeah, like what is wrong with you? Do you know what I mean? Like, what is it like? Do you need some sort of anger management? But of course, that's not what it is. Like the root cause is grief. The root cause is that my dad had died, and you know, I loved my dad and I missed my dad, and the anger is simply that. That's where it comes from, and these emotions show up in different ways. Um, Sometimes you'll just feel, well, I'd feel sick to my stomach. I'd just feel like something had just whacked me in the stomach, like taking the air out of me. And I remember, I think it was, God, what was it? I think it must have been many, many months after my mum died. I think my mum had died in the May of 2024. And I think in the September, there was one particular morning I remember vividly where I walked downstairs, and it was a very rare morning whereby the kids were still asleep, but my wife and I were awake. Um, and my wife had been down in the kitchen. I walked down to make a coffee and I leant against the side and we said good morning. And then my wife just looked at me and I just started welling up. And then my wife just grabbed hold of me and we had a hug there in the kitchen. And I just sobbed my heart out. I just sobbed uncontrollably. And like, I don't know, what was that, like 5 months after my mum died? But I knew that was why. In that moment, I just missed my mum. Do you know, like it just struck me. And grief doesn't care what day it is. It doesn't care how long it's been. It doesn't care about what you've got on or what you need to do. It doesn't care about any of that. And nor should it either. I think you know, the best thing that's helped me to cope with grief is allowing it to manifest, just allowing it to surface, because I think suppressing it ultimately is a disaster waiting to happen. It's just going to come back 10 times stronger. It's like putting, the top on a bottle of fizzy drink and shaking it. If you don't release the top every now and again, then it's just going to explode. And I feel like that's probably one of the things that helped me most with grief. But yeah, I think, for me, in terms of like how I managed to cope with grief and how I managed to live with it, well, as I said, like I did have fantastic support from people around me. I had we had SANS, which is a charity for which is a charity for uh, you know babies who die either stillborn or late miscarriage, and they're a fantastic charity, and they had group sessions near to us, so that after our baby Noah died, we would go once a week. It was in like a church locally, and we'd meet other parents, of babies who died, and we just get to talk. We just, I mean, a lot of the time, the first couple of sessions, we just listened, and then slowly but surely found ourselves just sharing like how we felt, and um, we journal about it as well. Like, we talk about kind of that grief, and I think that grief, like losing a baby, for me, I think it's not it's a totally different type of grief than like losing a parent, because of course I have no memories with Noah. Like, I never met Noah. Do you know? Well, I did, but I never met him while he was alive. Hannah gave birth to Noah while he was asleep. He was born asleep, as we say, and he never woke up. And we held him in our arms. Um, and I suppose the grief is the grief of his life, and what it would have been, rather than grieving, what it was. You're not you're not filled with all the memories that you have with Noah. You're filled with all the memories that you would have made. And I think they're equally tough to try and cope with. But SANS helped, because going to those group sessions, you got to talk with other people who understood. They got it. They got it big time. You'd be talking about hypothetical situations, the dreams that you had for your dead child. That's what you talk about. And that was you grieving. That was the equivalent, do you know what I mean, of talking about memories that you might have had with them. And then, for my dad, I I didn't get a chance to grieve for my dad, um, as I would have hoped, because I was totally distracted in trying to care for my mum. So from the moment my dad died, like, in fact, moments before my dad died, my mum had a seizure. So my dad was moved rooms about an hour or two before he actually passed away. And when we were walking from one room to the other, my mum had a seizure, which was quite common for my mum, and she had it in a hospital corridor. And so we managed to get my mum into a wheelchair, and then I wheeled my mum into the room, and she was pretty much unconscious up until maybe 20 minutes or so before my dad died, when she started to come round. And even then, she wasn't entirely lucid, which again was quite common after a seizure. So from even the moment before my dad actually passed away, I was distracted caring for my mum. And within 24 hours of my dad dying, I was back in the same hospital. In fact, he was in the morgue in the basement of the hospital, and I was with my mum bedside, who, she'd gone to the pub, got herself drunk, had a seizure in the pub. I'd carried her out into the car because the ambulance hadn't arrived by then, and got her to the hospital where, she was being triaged. And there I was, 24 hours after my dad died, back in the hospital. Um, So there was no time to grieve. There was no time to kind of process, what had gone on there. One thing I'm forever grateful for, and one thing I'm very fortunate for, is that I I had a I was working for Deloitte at the time, and the partner um, who I was line managed by was incredibly understanding, and I got a little bit of extra compassionate leave after my dad died, and then I actually went to the GP to explain the situation with my mum, and the GP signed me off with family stress. And so I think I had about 6 weeks after my dad died to try and figure out, firstly, how we were going to care for my mum. And then secondly, to try and cut myself a bit of time and a bit of space to grieve for my dad. And the things that really helped during that time was that I started to do like a phased return at work. And I would strongly suggest that I'm a huge proponent for a greater amount of compassionate leave. The fact is that 5 or 6 days when you lose someone like a parent or a child, it's not enough. And I think during that time when I had a phased return, I started to work in the mornings, uh, back at my normal day job, and then I would sign off at lunchtime, and I'd take the afternoon to myself. And what I would do every single day is I would just leave the house and I'd just walk. And I started to find, like, I got myself a little route that took me across like fields locally where we are, somewhere really quiet. Most of the time I wouldn't even come across anyone, and I would just walk. I'd just walk and walk, and I wouldn't really structure my thoughts. I wouldn't kind of purposefully think about, my dad. I just let it come, really. I just walked, and yeah, some days I'd feel tearful. Other days I'd feel angry. I'd feel resentment at the world, really. And other days, yeah, I just feel sad, just feel empty. But I just kept doing it, and it massively helped. I think that walking just helped me to process everything in the back of my mind, and it gave me that space. And after my mum died, I think I did have a lot more time and space and opportunity to grieve my mum. And in many ways, what was quite strange is that I realised that I hadn't fully grieved my dad. It was only after my mum died and after our responsibility to take care of my mum was lifted that I then started to have these like thoughts and feelings and memories of my dad again. But yeah, but it was far easier. I had far more space and time. You know, the way in which it happened, sadly, was that I'd actually handed in my notice to Deloitte, and when my mum's health deteriorated to the point whereby you know um, she wasn't going to recover, I was actually serving my notice period at work during that time, um, and my mum then died 30 days before my last day at work, and so I returned to work. I did what I wanted to do, which was to say goodbye. It was to sign off properly. It was to do the things that I felt like I needed to do. And then I handed my laptop back. I finished work and I took time to myself. and it was one of the best things that I could have done. And I didn't plan it that way. You can't plan these things in life. I had planned to use that notice period to look for new work, to look for another job. But as it worked out, I hadn't had 2 minutes to do that. And so found myself like, unemployed, but with this immense amount of space to grieve for my mum. After what had been, not just a traumatic 2 years of trying to care for her, but a traumatic 12 years, of crisis and family tragedy. And yeah, the grief for my mum did feel different. I think, my mum had had a very poor quality of life in the last 10 years of her life. My mum, she lived with a lot of demons, um, and she carried those with her all her life. And what mattered to her was family. All that ever mattered to my mum was us, her family, and loving her family and being loved by her family was all that she ever asked for in this world. And when my mum went through certain transitions, such as, my sister and I leaving home, and not being as dependent, upon her anymore. And when my mum eventually retired from work and again was not depended upon, by her colleagues, my mum found herself to be completely lost, and that really allowed the demons that she'd carried with her to surface, and that was tough, and that led to all kinds of mental health problems, and it also involved an accident that my mum had in 2016, which was 8 years before she died, and that was a traumatic brain injury, which left my mum with, you know, severe damage basically that was irreparable. She had 6 bleeds on the brain, um, fractured her skull in 7 places. And so, in many respects, there were things that my mum would never recover from, and there were things that my mum lived with, such as the seizures. And so, in many ways, I grieved the loss of my mum many, many years ago. I grieved for my mum before my mum died, because the mum that I knew, you know, when I was a child, the mum that I knew as an adolescent, as a young adult, I was a different person to my mum in the last 10 years of her life. And I think that's really important. Like, I think sadly, society very often looks at grief as loss of a life. But it forgets that it's not necessarily about, you know, flesh and blood at all. It's not necessarily about, a heart beating and then a heart stopping. Very often, grief is when something's there and then it's gone. You grieve what was, and you grieve what could have been. And so I think, for many people who have maybe been separated from a family member or a loved one, or someone in their life has changed, has changed for whatever reason, and uh, are just no longer recognizable. They become unrecognizable, and that grief is just as powerful as losing flesh and blood. It's just as powerful as a heart stopping beating, you know. So I think for me, like, I think in a way I probably found that I grieved our baby boy, my dad and my mum in different ways, you know, completely different ways. I grieved a life that my son never had. I grieved the life that my dad had, and I grieved the relationship that I had with him. By the time my mum died, I'd already grieved, you know, the mother that I knew once upon a time, you know, and the love that she gave me, and the things that she taught me, and the person who she made me into. But in 2024, when her heart stopped beating, you know, I wasn't necessarily grieving the person who I tried to keep alive, you know, against her best wishes for the latter end of her life. And so I think for me, yeah, I think grief, not only does it happen as a roller coaster, but grief is different for us all, and it is different with the different people in your life. And so I think now, looking to the future, like, we sold the family home, and it's time to say goodbye to that. It's time to walk around, what is essentially just bricks and mortar, and say goodbye, and say goodbye. And I think before my parents died, I totally underestimated what a physical space can mean emotionally. I way before my mum and dad died, I was encouraging them to sell the house, downsize, move somewhere else. I held no emotional connection to that house at all. In fact, I was resentful of that house in the end, because it was the house that my mum fell in. It was, the house whereby we'd had many a family dispute, we'd had many a family trauma. It felt like a shell, of what once was. It was like, much of it was stuck in time. Much of it hadn't been changed since I was 17. It hadn't moved on, and you know, for me, it was just full of ghosts and cobwebs, and it still is. It still is. There's certainly part of me that can detach emotionally from it and just think, you know what, it's had its day. It had its day a long time ago. But even so, now that I'm actually here, now that it is real, and we've actually verbally agreed to sell the house, I must be honest, I will sit there at that house. and I will shed a tear, you know, and I will also have a laugh and remember all of the amazing memories, in that house. Because as a friend once said to me, the day of my dad's funeral, you can't take those memories away, you know, no matter what came after, no matter what happened in the last 10 years of our family lives, no matter what chaos, crisis, tragedy, you still can't take away the good stuff. Even if that good stuff is like 30 years ago. And it was good stuff, trust me. It was New Year's Eve parties, you know, black tie New Year's Eve parties galore. We'd have 50, 60, 70, 80 people easy, full families, in there making memories, dancing the night away all night long. You'd wake up the next morning, there'd just be people lying strewn all over the house. It would be legendary. It was the house whereby, my sister would learn to ride a bike. It was the house whereby I'd kick a football with my friends until way after dark. And my mum and dad had set these security lights up just to allow us to keep playing. They were the hot August nights, me and my mates like exploring the beach nearby and then coming back and raiding the fridge. They were just beautiful memories, beautiful childhood memories that no one can ever take away. And I think back to that message, that I got from my friend on the day of my dad's funeral, and I was feeling down, I was feeling resentful, I was feeling sad that, the quality of life for him and my mum had been so poor, you know, in the years leading up to his death. And it's true, it was. And I think when someone close to you, like a parent, dies, and you've got years and years, maybe decades of memories, it's very difficult to get past the immediate recent times. It's very difficult to remember them any other way at first because it's tragic, it's traumatic. Seeing them on their deathbed, and that picture of them is very difficult to get past that at first. You know, you feel like what you've lost is them, that person in that bed, but of course you haven't. What you've lost is just so much more than that. In the case of my parents, it was 40 incredible years, that they had helped me to grow into the person who I am. And at first it's difficult, but then slowly but surely, you begin to remember, you begin to forget those last few years. You begin to forget the hard times and the trauma. You can put aside the really difficult memories and pictures in your mind at the hospital, and you then begin to wind back the clock and become that person, in those incredible memories, that you store in your mind and your heart that no one will ever take away from you. And so I think for me, yeah, I think, when it comes to grief, it's a roller coaster, and it's different for me for different people who I have lost in my life. But also as well, I think looking forward now to the future, I am grateful for it because I do live a more present life right now. I think on a daily basis, I play with my children right now, and I live as if, you know, I might not be here tomorrow. And however difficult it is to lose someone in your life, it helps you to appreciate, you know, who they were and what they meant to you. And that makes life that little bit richer. and it empowers us to live a life that matters, and to live each day, with purpose. And I think that's one of the great things to have come, from tragedy. And I think if you're watching this now and you are going through grief, if you're living through this, be that because you've lost a person who has died, or because you have lost a person or a relationship um, that hasn't necessarily died, but just gone from your life, then click the link below, book in for a call. Let's have an hour with no obligation, just to share. And hopefully I could pay forward, the things that have helped me and what's worked for me. And if we find that it's a fit and that we could work together, then we could then book in for coaching. I currently book my coaching in 6 week blocks, and we'd meet every week for an hour. And essentially we would just start to work through tools and techniques that could help you to manage grief, to overcome grief, and ultimately get to a place that is acceptance.